He heard the forest say his name, and his hands went numb. Elias Cortez had never believed in voices of trees, only the stubborn, patient voices of data. But there it was, low and human, threaded through the wind, so intimate it felt like his father's breath. Elias. The syllable vibrated through the damp ground beneath his boots and through the rib cage of the old growth like a bell. When he turned, the silhouette above the mossy knoll made the pine trunks look small. She moved like a mountain releasing itself from fog, step by step, long hair braided with lichen, shoulders vast enough that the sun needed to tilt to clear her. Pushchin's eyes were winter lakes, and for the first time in 36 years, Elias realized that some promises had been made to things older than men. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He should have raised his camera. He should have retreated with the careful, methodical detachment his fieldwork demanded. Instead, Elias's fist clenched around the pocket of his worn moleskine where his father's name was scribbled within a faded photograph, an oath inked there when the hospital lights were sterile and his father's hands were thin as roots. The promise had been simple then: find something that mattered, don't let it be forgotten. He blinked, and the myth filled the clearing like a tidal truth. Pushchin's breath fogged the air, each exhale stirring dead leaves into small, trembling storms. Her voice, when she spoke, was not confined to the throat. It uncoiled from her like a current, shaping the pine boughs, making the air press against his skin. You come with your notebooks and your hunger. Why, human, do you think our story will save you? Elias's training flooded him with questions, protocols, ethics, but those felt thin next to the raw ache under his sternum. Because, he started, and the word fractured. Because my father told me to listen. Because my work has been a ledger of other people's disappearances, and I am tired of tallying losses without names. Because he wanted me to bring proof that the world could still surprise us into caring for it. Pushchin's lips, if one could name those formidable features that were more like carved wood and storm-smooth stone than anything human, twitched that might have been curiosity. Her head tilted, and for an impossible moment the old forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if hearing a distant bell, something deeper and more ancient answered her. A chorus of leaves and the distant scrape of fur against bark, harmonizing in a way that made Elias's cheeks prickle. He heard it as warning and as lament. A shadow watched from the camp edge. Anya Marku had not stepped forward. She never stepped forward first.
She stood beyond the circle of her watchfire, hood drawn low, the leather of her ranger's coat creaking like a close protected secret. Her jaw was a blade when she looked at Elias, more than skepticism, something that tasted of accusation. She had expected strangers. She had been raised on strangers coming with cameras, with wallets, with empty promises. She had not expected a man who watched the Guardian as if he recognized a ghost. "Stay back," she told Elias in Romanian, voice not quite steady, fingers white on the strap of her rifle. The words were as much for Pushchin as for him. Oaths lived on Anya's tongue like hot coals she feared would burn the map of her family. Her grandmother's warning, "Do not let them know how close we are," felt like a weight behind her teeth. Anya had learned to protect the forest with flat, efficient actions, a diversion here, a fausse trail there, lies folded into bread and left at the edge of villages. She had sworn to keep the pact her family had kept for generations. The Guardian's existence was a hinge upon which everything fragile balanced. To reveal them was to tear the hinge. Elias watched Anya watch Pushchin, and the structure of his frazzled confidence began to buckle. Here was a human who had trained herself not to blink at impossible things. Here was someone whose life was braided with the same myth he had come to test. He wanted to cross the moss between them, to reach for her hand and say, "I carry proof, I carry guilt, I carry the last words of my father." But something in Anya's posture said that words could be knives, being seen might be harm. Pushchin rumbled then, a long, low sound like the forest settling into its own bones. Her nostrils flared. She spoke again, and the language was not one Elias knew, yet he understood it like a meter of tide, grief, resolve, and a terrible crystalline clarity. "We are leaving," she said in a voice that finally rendered itself intelligible to him. The covenant phrase, "Your kind takes more than you return. We go where the roots remember the old songs." The world compressed to a single point in Elias's chest. Leaving. The impossibility of it made his lungs tighten. to imagine the Guardians, their enormous, slow lives that had always been a background mercy to villages and to the ecology itself, pulling back was like imagining the moon leaving its orbit. Proof or not, his mind, hungry for manuscript lines and institutional grant letters, shifted immediately to strategy. If they were leaving, then their biosignatures, their behaviors, their unique symbioses were data points that could change conservation policy forever. If she would let him record, if he could carry a narrative to a world that could press the brakes on destruction, then perhaps the leaving could be averted. Pushkin watched him with the wearied patience of something older than regret. "Why do you ask to be witness, small one?" she said.
"What will you do with our bones and our breath? Will your papers feed the hunger that drives us away?" Elias felt all the weight of where he had been complicit. Before this, he had taken funding from a lab with industry ties. Before this, he had agreed to withhold certain genetic sequences in exchange for a grant that had paid hospital bills. Belatedly, slowly, like frost thawing, he realized how easily science could be used as a carriage for greed. The photograph in his pocket, that day in the hospital when his father pressed his own weathered hand into his palm and whispered, "Remember the stories," made his throat close. "I can't promise I haven't failed," he said, "but I swear, I'll tell the truth. I'll carry it to those who will listen." Anya's laugh, short, sharp, cut through the mist. "Truth," she repeated, not unkindly. "Human truth is a splinter. It provokes hands to tear and to pierce." Her eyes flicked toward the neat line of Elias's field gear, the notebooks, the recorder clipped to his strap. "You do not know us. You do not know what names we keep." "Teach me," Elias said, and it came out like a plea. He had rehearsed rhetoric for months, capital T theology of conservation, but none of it fit the rawness of standing beneath the gaze of something that had watched empires rise out of ash, only to be consumed by their own appetites. "Teach me, and I will learn. I will stand with you." Pushkin's gaze moved from Elias to Anya and lingered on the woman like the slow passage of clouds across a mountain's face. There was a recognition there that had nothing to do with biology or boundary. "You call for witnesses," she said. "Very well, but words are uneven things. They can save, and they can slay." The ranger's hands twitched. Behind her, where the slope dipped away into the tangle of the Carpathian dark, a machine hummed like a wasp at a lantern, dim and distant, but present. It was the sound Anya had grown to measure in the distance like a clock counting down. It belonged to a logging crew that had been prowling the forest edge since the autumn. She had kept them at bay with paperwork and with ancestral knowledge, a drawing here, a rumor there, a dead end of bureaucratic red tape that had been paid for in whispered threats and a certain kind of silence. The machine meant inevitability. Roads, scarred trunks, companies with ledgers that did not weep. Elias heard it too. Up until this month, his life had felt like a sequence of small betrayals and postponed ethics. He knew with the clarity of a man who has watched a city sewer bottle up to the point of overflow that once the timbermen cut through, the Guardians' ability to mask themselves would be compromised. His journalistic hunger became a blade. It could cut a path to protection or a wound that bled the forest dry if used by the wrong hands. Anya's secret rested on a razor.
The Marku line had kept the pact, not by piety alone, but by guarding a ledger of truths tucked inside family lore. Who had seen the Guardians, where they slept, and most dangerous of all, the sound that called them back. A betrayal. The Marku line had kept the pact, not by piety alone, but by guarding a ledger of truths tucked inside family lore. Who had seen the Guardians, where they slept, and most dangerous of all, the sound that called them back. A betrayal generations ago, names passed like poison, had pushed the Guardians to retreat. Anya had been raised on the absolute rule, preserve the balance. The presence of Elias at Pushkin's feet, promising words and waving instruments, felt like betrayal made fresh. "Why should we trust your promise?" Anya said. Her voice had the weight of folded iron. "Your kind has treaties with hunger and corporations who buy silence." He flinched as if struck. The past he had tried to keep private, phone calls with a former collaborator now working for a logging conglomerate, an old email where he had shared partial data, scratched like a splinter under his skin. "I will make them listen," he said. "I will tell them everything I know. I will—" "You cannot make them hearts," Anya interrupted. "We kept them blind because sight breeds machines. You speak change like a remedy, but do you know what it will ask of you? To give them power is to tie love into a leash. Between them, Pushchin lowered her head until the tips of her hair brushed the moss, and from somewhere deep beneath the forest floor, a sound rose like the memory of rain. Her pronouncement hung in the wet air like a storm threatened but not yet arrived. We will leave. Perhaps some will be persuaded to stay by your kind's humility. Perhaps some will be harvested. Choose your truth, human. Choose your heart. Elias's chest was tight with the weight of a dilemma that had no clear good. To speak, to reveal, to become the voice of the guardians, he could save forests and break trust. To stay silent would be a betrayal of everything his father had asked of him. He had walked into the Carpathians expecting to collect folklore and maybe a smear of DNA. Instead, the mountain had given him a choice that would demand the measure of his soul. Night dropped like a curtain. The watchfire between them flickered and painted new faces on old bark. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the logging machine thudded again, closer. The pact, like the forest, held its breath. The promise in his pocket, the photograph, the schematic grants on his phone, each one seemed to weigh equal and terrible. He thought of how his father had died, insisting that stories mattered, and he thought of how Anya's family had kept a silence to save the world. Tomorrow, Elias said into the dark, the word a small lantern thrown across an abyss. Tomorrow I will show you everything I have. I will make them listen. Anya's eyes softened, just a fraction, but her hands were steady on her rifle, a map of duty and fear etched into the sinew. Pushchin's shoulders rose like a procession of clouds.
The forest held them close and waited for what would come with the dawn, what secrets would be given, what betrayals would be revealed, and who, in the end, would be allowed to speak for what they loved. Dawn crawled in pale and wounded over the ridge. The forest held them close and waited for what would come with the dawn, what secrets would be given, what betrayals would be revealed, and who, in the end, would be allowed to speak for what they loved. Dawn crawled in pale and wounded over the ridges, and with it came the thin first offering light that made the wet trunks shine like the spines of old books. Elias woke with the impression that the forest had been speaking in his sleep, names, notations, fragments of a language that might have been science or prayer, and the memory of Pushchin's winter eyes sat behind his ribs like a second heart. He moved after coffee and something that passed for a morning ritual among field workers, inventory, recharging batteries, the slow sanctimony of packing the recorder as if that small device might be the ark. Anya watched him from the edge of the ashes, her fingers tucked warm into her coat. She had not slept much, and the lines at the corners of her eyes had the sharpness of someone who had carried too many nights alone. Between them, the clearing frowned like an old woman cautious of strangers. "You have until midday," she said, the English laced with the Romanian vowels that always softened her commands. "You show me what's in your hands, then we decide whether you go beyond the creek." "That's fair." He set the recorder on a stump and uncapped his pen. The instruments, sensors for humidity, a small drone folded like an insect, a stack of indices mapping previous sightings, were all ordinary and terrible in their potential. "I will be transparent. No obfuscation, no bargaining." Anya's mouth flattened. The word transparency had become a test of character among her people. It was also almost laughable. Humans with transparent intentions could still hide corrosion beneath the glass. She thought of the ledger passed down by her grandmother, a brittle book that catalogued transgressions and names and dates, kept in the hollow of a beech tree behind the village chapel where priests still made the sign of the cross to things that mattered. Every generation had added stains to those pages. Trust had a cost. "First," she said, "you tell me about the person who tipped the logging company." Elias felt the color drain from him. In the dim, private places of his conscience, he had dissected the mistake a dozen times. He had not meant for the information to leak. He had believed the collaborators' intentions were conservationist, that sharing habitat maps would help protect corridors. The man had turned out to have a spine of money and a mouth that traded in commodities. Rage, shame, and the old familiar ache of guilt converged in his throat. "I will tell you everything," he said. "I never wanted this. If I had known—" "You knew enough to send coordinates," Anya interrupted, "and enough to merit the attention." Elias swallowed. "I sent generalized coordinates. I did not—" He stopped. The fact of his complacency was as real as blood.
He could feel how easy it would be for Anya to file him under the long list of those who had spoken and then taken shelter behind the shield of excuses. He tried to read her face for leniency and found instead the iron edge of duty. Pushkin moved then, a ripple traveling across the clearing, as if that great body could no longer contain the small things humans called anxiety. "Words like a river," she said softly, not to Elias so much as to the clearing itself. "They appear and wash the bank." Which bank? Which shore? Anya's reply was a look. It said the bank where her grandmother had buried a pistol for emergencies. The shore where the children's names were kept safe from being listed in corporate files. She had learned to sculpt her life around the necessities of secrecy. Elias knelt and opened his field notebook. He handed it to Anya with deliberate slowness, pages fluttering like moth wings. The journal contained charts and sketches and the careful, almost childish zeal of someone who had always believed that cataloging was salvation. He had included contact logs, email headers, even the clipped messages from his one-time collaborator, Tomasz Litza, a man who had once been a mentor and had become a stain. Anya took the book and read, as if reading could rearrange the world. Elias watched the muscles under her jaw work. When she reached the page with Tomasz's name, a sound like a struck wire threaded through her body. She folded the page back and peered at him. Why give him anything? He promised funding for the communities, Elias said. He said habitat corridors could be protected if there was pressure. He said, he could feel the word promised taste like old coins. I believed him. I believed the will to act could be bought without selling the thing itself. Her eyes softened in a way that threatened to disarm him. And you think publicizing will not be trade? I think it's the only chance, Elias said. If people see Pushkin, see the Guardians, feel the truth, maybe not all, but some will stop. Not everyone is Tomasz. She snorted. Some, she repeated. A dangerous word for a dangerous hope. She handed the notebook back. You can come to the creek, but no footage leaves this valley without my say. And you leave your drone here. He hesitated only a heartbeat. The drone held the capability for the proof he dreamed of. High-resolution scans, thermal imagery. He had tucked it away in the little cave of his pack, not just for efficiency, but because he knew how easily images became commodities. With a quiet, surprising decisiveness, he undid the latch and set the folded insect of nylon and motor onto the stump. It looked small and inadequate next to Pushkin's shadow. Good, Anya said. Come. They moved through the understory like two people who had been assigned to defuse a potential disaster.
Elias learned to be silent in new ways, observing how Anya's boots avoided leaf litter, how she read the slight bends in young trees as if they were sentences giving instructions. She pointed to a scarred beach where a century-old wound had healed around an embedded nail, to moss that only grew on the side sheltered from the wind. Pushkin walked a few paces ahead, a presence that bent light and gravity. You are from Bucharest? Anya asked at last, the words like a small boat reaching for shore. Once, he answered. Now I bounce between field stations and lectures. My father's family was from the mountains, Mexico, but he believed in the old stories. He taught me to look up as well as down. Your accent shifts like a borrowed coat, she said. Child of two places. I'm trying to be the man he hoped, Elias said, which, translated, meant, I'm trying to stop looking at the world in paragraphs and begin reading it in sentences. The apology in his voice made his hands small. They reached the creek, and the world narrowed to the sound of water like soft coins spun in a bowl. The air here smelled of iron and pine, and the bright, almost metallic scent of sap. Pushkin halted at the water, toes splayed like great fossils. She looked at Anya and then at Elias, and something like pity and challenge lay in that look. Tell me about the leaving, Anya said. Is it ritual or escape? Pushkin's answer was an image that Pushkin painted with her voice. Roots gathering, songs threaded through the earth, whole bands of guardians stepping out of sight where the forest's owns met the other, and other that might be a place of moss-laden memory, or a hiding, or a true home. Some leave for safety, she said.
Some leave because watching becomes a wound. Some leave to carry seed into dreams where humans are not. Elias pressed his palms into his knees. Is there a way to change that? To make you stay? It depends on what you offer, Pustine said, and whether your kind hears calls beyond what feeds you. Anya's jaw tightened. You cannot ask humans to be saints, she said. They are not given to saints. They are given to appetites and ideologies. Then ask them for the hard things. Elias's voice rose with a hunger that surprised him. Not for halting the mills once, but for a living discipline, laws that bind, reparations that restore, communities given power over their woodlands. Nothing sold, nothing patented, a vow. Anya watched him, and in her eyes the wall she had kept for years started to show a hairline fracture. He did not plead like a grant seeker. He spoke like a man whose nights were made of old photographs and who had finally woken to the size of this failure. The rawness of it unsettled her in ways she had not anticipated. What plans had Anya had for surrender? She had imagined confrontation, furtive sabotage, perhaps even violence in the end. She had not imagined wanting to fold into conversation with the person who might ruin everything.
Words alone are not a vow, she said at last, and vows must be enforced. Who will enforce them? Communities, Elias said softly. Not corporations, not bureaucrats. People who live in the land, who will be held accountable because their own kitchens depend on the forest. And scientists. If we bind them to public stewardship, to open-source protection, to legal custodianship. Pustine's breath smoothed the creek's face. Open your hands, human, she said to Elias. Show me the proof that they will hold. Not your rhetoric, not your desire. Show me where the hinge will be. Elias opened his field notebook, and with Anya leaning closer, began to outline a plan. Not in the language of grants, but in the language of community. Maps tied to local stewardship, legal mechanisms named not as protection, but as kinship law, clauses forbidding genetic patenting, provisions for rewilding, community-managed timber economies with strict quotas set by ecological need rather than market demand. He sketched circles and arrows like a man building a bridge between two cliffs. Anya watched the lines and felt something in the marrow of her sternum shift. The ledger of her ancestors, binding, secretive, and fearful, had always worked because it insulated the guardians from machinery. Could it be expanded into a living law that involved the human world rather than hiding from it? Her training shrieked caution. Her heart, which she had trained to be an evergreen of duty, fluttered with hesitant, dangerous hope. When they rose from the creek, a sound like thunder had been swallowed by the woods. The logging machine had moved closer. Metal and smell invaded the clearing in the way sickness invades a body, impertinent, remorseful, hungry. Elias felt a coldness that wasn't just fear. It was the knowledge that the timeline had advanced without their permission. The moment for plans and promises and sketches had been collapsed into the immediacy of action. Anya's hand slid down to the rifle at her hip, not quite in threat, but in readiness. Pustine straightened, and the trees around them seemed to line up, a low scored order like sentinels waiting. Elias's mouth dried. Clarity had always been a thin thing, and now it was a blade that required him to choose. We have until the machines cut the first beach, Pustine said, voice as steady as the stream. Until then, human, you must learn whether your words are seeds or ash. Anya looked at him, and in the small compass of her gaze there was pity and suspicion, a little tenderness, and a fissure of something urgent that might become love in a later time if they survived now. She tucked her hair behind her ear, an old human gesture that made her suddenly, shockingly vulnerable. You have to understand, she said quietly, that if you fail, if your words make dining and oil and property out of our kin, we will not forgive you. The ledger will add your name.
Elias stared at her and for the first time understood what it meant to be held accountable by a people who had nothing to gain by mercy. He felt the truth of her accusation like a branded thing across his soul. Then teach me to be forgiven, he said, and the plea in his voice was not for absolution, but for discipline. Teach me how to speak so they listen, not so they take. Pushchin watched them both with a look that might have been curiosity or judgment.
And in that shared, vulnerable space, something like a fragile accord took shape. They would try. They had the hours until the blades touched bark to weave their small, improvised covenant. The push toward each other was fierce. Professionals cast into a theater of survival where the stakes were ancestral and immediate. The pull was the longing to be trusted, to be chosen as an instrument of redress rather than offense. As they returned to the clearing, the three of them, woman, man, and myth, moved like a nascent triad of improbable allies. Elias carried a new humility already forming in his stance. Anya carried a ledger, unclipped from fear but not from caution. Pushkin carried the weight of winters and the soft, terrible decision of departure. The logging machine's thrum became a timeline against which they would measure every word henceforth. In that heartbeat, with the forest leaning in to listen, Elias and Anya found something dangerous and undeniable. Proximity had softened suspicion into attention, and attention had the uncanny power to rearrange commitments. The first chainsaw came like a cough. Its sound ripped through the hush of the Carpathians less as noise than as accusation, metal biting into wood with a mechanical greed that made the birds fall silent. The machine's light flashed like a wound against trunk and moss. The men who followed it moved with the precise, casual cruelty of those who work by ledger and not love. One of them kicked a sapling aside as if testing whether the forest felt. Elias felt the kick like a fist to the chest. Anya's face tightened as if the skin itself had learned how to armor. Her fingers closed on the rifle, then she loosened them. Pushkin made no dramatic gesture. She only drew breath, a long inhalation that seemed to gather storms. In the hush that followed, a zip of nervous laughter, soldiers of the saw, lifted and then curdled into unease when two great shadows moved between them and the machines. "Stop," Pushkin said. It was not a command in a human sense, but it was a thing that unsettled the men enough that they became small, ashamed. Metal clattered. The leader spat a curse and then tried to laugh it off as bravado. One of the younger loggers reached for his phone with the reflex of an industry that documents to justify, the cameras of capitalism. Elias' heart stuttered. He had told himself he would not be that man who handed the forest over for a grant.
Yet the reflex to record, to prove, to own, was in his blood as much as in any corporation's boardroom. "Go home," Anya said. Her voice was ice. Every syllable carried the weight of oaths knit through generations. "This land is protected. The permit is false." The man with the laugh, brash, underseasoned, snorted, and raised his hand in a slow, theatrical shrug. "We've got a contract," he said, "and we have the coordinates. Whoever gave you the maps can't be trusted to keep things hidden." Elias felt the color drain. The leak had a name. It had been a man who had once been kind and who now made money from the quickening of blades. Tomasz Licha, the mentor, the smoothed smile that had traded trust for stock options. He had thought long ago that the mistake was inadvertent. The longer truth coalesced in his mind like thawing ice. Tomasz had known exactly what to do with the map. "You," Anya said, pinpointing Elias as if his name could be a wound. "You gave the coordinates." He wanted to deny it with a professional lie, ambiguity, nuance, the generalized coordinates, but the weight of the ledger in his pocket, the photograph of his father's hand, the memory of hospital fluorescence, all conspired against him. The truth pressed from him like breath from a lung that had not been used. "I shared data. I thought he said he could help protect corridors." His voice was thin and small and, to his shame, adolescent. He had believed in solutions that arrived folded in other people's suits. Anya's eyes were not satisfied. "You fed it to a man who sells land," she said. The accusation was not just about this moment, but about every compromise that built itself into a life. The small allowances, the funding grants, the moral accounting papered over by necessity. "You fed us to men who do not see kin." Elias tried to explain, and the words failed the way tools fail when the task is moral reckoning and not geological sampling. He could tell her of his father's request to remember stories. He could hand her his notebook like a child trying to buy forgiveness with treasures. But none of it would wash away the fact that an email thread had existed and had been turned into currency. He thought of Tomasz in a city office, laughing over spreadsheets, and the realization that exposure could be more lethal than silence settled into him like cold. "Then why should I trust you now?" Anya demanded. "Why should I let your voice touch anything we do?" Pushchin's eyes, winter lakes and infinite, held Elias for the briefest pause. And in that look he felt every misstep he'd taken as if they were fossilized and visible. "You have given me reasons to doubt," she said, voice a rumble like distant avalanche. "But doubt is a living thing. It can either root you in carefulness or strangle you in fear." Before he could answer, one of the loggers, small, nervous, perhaps more frightened of his own conscience than the forest, stepped forward and shoved his phone towards Elias, as if bestowing evidence.
"You see?" he said. "He gave us the spot, man. He was excited about a discovery. You were telling us how to get in." Elias caught his own reflection in the phone screen, pale, disheveled, and utterly human. He snatched the device and felt the tremor of someone's narrative being made at his hands. In a single motion, he registered two choices. He could hand the phone back and let a photograph begin the unspooling of a trade. Or he could shatter it, a small rebellion against the spectacle economy. He chose to press the power button, scroll, and find the messages. The screen held them there, stark and small. Tomasz had written with a charm Elias remembered from better days, professional and persuasive. "This could be a major find," the text read. "With the right framing, grants will come. We can funnel aid to villages. This is conservation with profit." Elias's chest tightened. The follow-up messages were currency. Coordinates refined, times noted, maps attached. It read like a betrayal written in polite ink. Anya read over his shoulder, and the only sound she made was a breath like a blade drawn. "You gave him the key," she said. "You named our house." There is a thing that happens when trust fractures. It starts not with animosity, but with astonishment. Anya could not quite reconcile the man who had stood by the creek promising covenants with the man whose fingerprints were now on the ledger that would invite machines. Elias felt something inside him give way. Shame, yes, but also an ugly, consuming anger at Tomasz that made his hands clench. "I will fix it," he said, and the phrase came out like an oath one makes in the dark when the household is burning. The words felt insufficient even as they left his mouth. Anya looked at him, and the expression on her face was not forgiveness. It was a map, betrayal catalogued and labeled, consequences named. "Fix it," she echoed, "or the ledger will name you." The machines moved closer. The loggers, sensing the tension and hunger for a fight larger than themselves, prodded, trying to make the forest secondary to their schedule. One of them, the leader, barked something about legal rights and permits, the kind of hollow-voiced authority that had toppled trees and polities for centuries. His men laughed and shoved. The forest answered them with a chorus of small, outraged sounds. A twig snapping, a bird screaming, the low roll of Pushchin. The edges of everything sharpened. Anya stepped forward between them and Pushchin, like a shield. "You leave now," she told the loggers. When the leader shrugged and advanced, as if privilege was armor, she reached not for the rifle, but for a small, weathered leather thing at her belt and opened it. The leather held a page from the Marku ledger, crudely stitched, old, and carrying the weight of generations. Anya had always kept it where no one would think to look, a book that named those who had broken vows, those who had been forgiven, those who had not.
She held it out like evidence, and the air changed. "This," she said quietly, "is a list of names. It shows what happens when the guardians are trailed and spidered into commerce. Look, if you wish." The leader laughed at first, and then, inexplicably, grew pale. In his pocket, his own daughter's name might be a trick. The ledger spoke instead to a part of him that some men still cared for: shame. Tomasz's voice sounded behind them then, sharp, amused, and sickeningly familiar. He had arrived with a small convoy of suited men and a variety of bright, professional tools. He moved with the confident stride of someone who believed the world was his to interpret. He looked at Elias and Anya like an actor reading cue markers. "Elias," he said, almost indulgently, "what an extraordinary coincidence." Elias felt every cell tightened at the sound of that voice. The man who had been his mentor now wore industry like armor. His smile was precise. "You lied," Elias said. Tamash's smile tweaked. "I made arrangements," he said, "to ensure what is rare is managed. You have to understand, people will pay. Conservation requires capital, Elias. It's a complicated ecosystem." Anya's eyes slashed. "Capital does not equal care. It equals ownership." "You romanticize poverty as virtue," Tomasz said smoothly. "That's why people like me exist, to translate your zeal into action." He gestured to his men. "We have the permit. It will only be a matter of hours before the first trees come down." Elias could feel the pivot of a new betrayal, this time not a lapse but a philosophy. Tomasz believed in markets first. The forest was a ledger entry to him, not a kin. The thing that cut deepest was that Elias had indirectly paved the road for this worldview by feeding him coordinates, by trusting a man who had sold the art of stewardship for a column on a balance sheet. Anya stepped forward. "If a man who claims to care for conservation comes with chainsaws, he is a man who cares for profit." Tomasz lifted his hands in mock surrender. "It's not simple," he said. "We can create reserves, we can partner, we can monetize ecotourism." "Monetize," Anya spat. "You mean make the sacred spectacle a marketable product. We will not be a zoo." Elias pulled at his sleeves, at the old private seams of his life. He had to choose a path that was no longer theoretical. He could hand over every note, every recording, and hope that the world would be kinder than predatory. Or he could destroy his own materials, cut the avenue of exploitation, and offer himself as a kind of penance, silence in exchange for trust. He thought of his father's pale hands and the way the hospital fluorescences had made everything body and truth. He thought about how the Guardians leaving would reshape thousands of human lives if they were taken as mere spectacle. He thought of Anya, her ledger, her stubbornness, the fragile, fierce way she had allowed herself to look at him, and he felt a fear that was not only for the forest, but for the small, radiant possibility between them. "Show them the ledger," Pushkin said to Anya, deflecting her. "Show them what you protect, not as theatrics, but as contract." Anya did, and the leader's hand trembled as he paged through the names, stories of taken animals and a village's collapse under logging. The men's bravado thinned like morning fog. Tamash's smirk remained, but it had the shadow of calculation now. What was profit if the community rose against it? In the heart-quick edge of that moment, Elias did something that surprised even him. He drew his recorder from his pocket, looked at Anya for the barest of instants, an apology, a plea, and then smashed it into the stones of the creek. The device burst and gave one high, small keening sound before going still. Silence hit, as if an unseen net had been thrown over the clearing. Tomasz barked, disbelieving laughter, but the loggers shuffled, unsure of what spectacle they were meant to harvest. Anya's stare was a physical thing. She deserved his silence, and he had broken his own tools in ritual atonement. He had destroyed his capacity to monetize the site, and in doing so, had offered a form of proof. He would not be the instrument of their exposure. He had chosen penance over publication. For a breath, nothing happened. Then a man in Tamash's party shoved forward, anger and corporate entitlement braided into his posture. In the push, he hit a curve of earth and tumbled, catching at a root. A sound, human and raw, escaped him, a cry like a child. The disturbance woke something in the forest. Pushkin's shoulders rose, and with a movement like shaking off snow, she sent a flurry of leaves and a gust of wind that shoved the men back as if the land itself had palms. The leader swore outright and retreated, flanked by men who no longer found resolve in the idea of easy profit. Tomasz, however, did not retreat. He looked at Elias as if the man were an insect to be crushed. "You think smashing your toys will save the trees?" Tomasz hissed. "You think secrecy is salvation? Either you hand over what you have or I go to the press. I will tell the world of this guardian and sell it as protection. People will pay to see it. You, Elias, are an opportunity." The air between Tomasz and Elias vibrated with history, former mentorship twisted into weaponry. Elias felt himself shrink and then harden.
The man he had been, the one who calculated grants and bent ethics as needed, sagged like the worn coat in him. He had no full plan to stop Tomasz. He only had the truth of his own shame and the decision he'd just made to break his instruments. "You will not use them as a spectacle," Anya said, stepping forward, with the calm of someone inured to making impossible moral trades. "If you bring cameras, we will make sure every contract is in the open. No patents."
No exclusive rights. We will take your company to court. We will name you in the ledger if you betray us. Tomasz's jaw twitched. "Good luck," he said. "One man cannot stop capital." Pushkin's voice lowered until it was almost sea sound. "We are not counting on one man," she said. "We are counting on a different kind of law." In the friction of that exchange, everything that had been tentative between Anya and Elias became raw. She looked at him with an expression that held both gratitude, he had smashed the recorder, and something deeper and lonelier, fear that he would be the instrument of ruin. Fear that someone she had begun to think of as comrade might yet be the hand that opened the ledger to predators. "You swore to tell the truth," she said softly, "not to stop the bleeding, but to stop the cause." Elias could only meet her gaze. The ledger between them was not only about the forest, but about the ledger of promises he had not kept. He had sworn to his father that he would carry stories. Now he saw the horrifying accountability of that vow. He had to learn to be silent and brave at once. "Do not follow us, Tomasz," finally, her voice a blade sharpened by necessity. "Leave now. Otherwise we will make sure the state and the people know everything." Tomasz laughed, a thin, metallic sound. "You think the people will believe a ranger and a scientist who smashed his recorder?" "I think you underestimate the people," Anya said, and there was fire in that sentence. "They will know who buys timber and who sells their souls." Tomasz retreated with a thin promise to return and a threat to publish. The convoy's taillights pricked the night as they receded. The clearing exhaled like a body that had just run from a predator. Pushkin lowered her head to the earth and nuzzled a beach, as if acknowledging the wound. The ledger at Anya's hip thudded against her thigh like a small heartbeat. When the last machine lights winked away, Anya turned to Elias, not with vindictiveness, but with Ruin's honest appraisal. "You broke your toy," she said. "Maybe that helps, but you will have to earn trust that cannot be bought. For now, you will not be allowed to carry any document beyond this valley. You will not leave with footage. You will not speak." The sentence landed like a sentence of exile. Elias felt his chest hollow, as if some internal voice had been cut. "You will not let me," he said. "I will not let you make us into something that can be sold," she interrupted. "If you love the forest, you will understand." He understood and he did not. Love had many languages: sacrifice, stubbornness, quiet. He had just committed to silence as penance, but the ache of a lifetime publicism combated the stillness Anya demanded. He wanted to shake her and make her see that the world sometimes needed proof to care. He wanted to tell her that a story could be the thing that saved the forest. He also knew, bone-tired, that his stories could be the fuel for machines.
He knelt in the sodden moss and looked up at Pushkin, who watched him with a patience that was neither hostile nor kind. "I will stay silent," he said, "for now. I cannot promise I will always be silent. My nature resists it, but I will try." Anya stared at him as if measuring the weight of his sincerity. Then she stepped forward and placed a single thing into his hand without ceremony, a simple, worn ring of woven birch bark, Anya's family sigil of watchfulness. "This binds you to us in a way the ledger cannot," she said. "Wear it if you mean it." He knelt in the sodden moss and looked up at Pushkin, who watched him with a patience that was neither hostile nor kind. "I will stay silent," he said, "for now. I cannot promise I will always be silent. My nature resists it, but I will try." Anya stared at him as if measuring the weight of his sincerity. Then she stepped forward and placed a single thing into his hand without ceremony, a simple, worn ring of woven birch bark, Anya's family sigil of watchfulness. "This binds you to us in a way the ledger cannot," she said. "Wear it if you mean it." He slid the ring onto his finger like a penance and felt it bite his skin. It was small, ridiculous, and yet heavy with significance. In that act of refusal to publish, of accepting exile from his own ambitions, something between them frayed, but something else took a breath. It was not yet trust. It was a fragile agreement born of smoke and threat and the shared knowledge that one wrong move could name them all in the ledger as architects of their own ruin. Pushkin lifted her head then and released a breath that was almost like laughter. "You think the world will listen to a man who keeps his mouth shut?" she asked. "Perhaps, or perhaps they will forget. This is the risk of silence and the currency of courage." Elias felt the ledger of his life tilt. He had traded the possibility of fame for the work he had not known how to do, the slow building of trust. Anya watched him with a look that was part challenge and part invitation. "Learn to be forgiven," she said, "not by words, but by what you do when you have no audience." He swallowed, and the forest around them hummed like a living thing mending. But the fracture had been made. Tomasz would not forget. The loggers would not either. The ledger, paper, memory, and scandal already had the names of men who would stop at nothing to own the rare. Night descended like velvet and stitched the clearing into a gash of arm and heart. Elias sat then on a fallen trunk and let the enormity of his decision settle. He would be silent for now. He had given up a voice that might have saved, and that loss sat in his chest like a wound from which he could still, perhaps, grow something new. Anya retreated into the trees to leave Pushkin to her own counsel, and when she left, Elias felt that she had taken with her a piece of the forest's hard, clear law. He touched the birch ring and felt its weave, and somewhere between remorse and resolve, something else stubbornly grew. The truth of his love for this wild world, and quietly, the beginning of a love for the woman who had made him choose again. The first strike of saw on beach came at sunrise like an answered summons. The sound threaded through the trees and set a dozen small birds into choreography of alarm. Elias felt it as if the world had been nicked, blood from bark, and it made his stomach roll with a clarity that left no room for argument.
He stood, birch ring warm against his palm, and watched the crew fan out like dark insects across the slope. Anya moved before he did. She slipped into the tree line with the lithe, efficient grace of someone who had learned to be invisible and then decided not to be. Elias followed, because whatever else he had surrendered, the recorder, his right to speak beyond the valley, he could not surrender the moment's action. Words could wait. There was work to be done. They split the machine line with a single silent plan. Slow them enough to allow Pushkin to close the old gap where the Guardians could fold into the underearth if necessary, or to create enough political outrage before the timber met road. Anya's plan was not elegant. It was a braid of guerrilla law and ritual. Names read aloud, sacred chants Anya had been forbidden to teach, filings faxed in frantic hand-delivered pages to the nearest municipal office. Elias's contribution was the thing he had almost destroyed, his ability to sacrifice personal ambition. He would give them his access. He would call in favors not for fame, but to force a bureaucratic stop. He walked forward into the clearing and did the most dangerous public thing he had done in years. He met Tomasz face to face, with no recording and no shield but his bare conscience. The suited man smiled like a blade, the men around him puffing themselves up. For a heartbeat, Elias thought of capitulation and the easy comfort of silence. Then he thought of the small ledger at Anya's hip, of Pushkin's winter eyes, and he felt his father's hand close around his like a benediction. "Tomasz," Elias said loudly enough for the machines and the men in the trees to hear, "this is my work. I helped you. I will not—" He stopped. There was a crowd, curiosity like a tide. Cameras, phones, raised. Anya's hand on his sleeve was a current, not to speak for spectacle, but to buy time. Tomasz's face hardened. "You will sign the transfer," he said. "You will sign cooperation. We can salvage this." "Salvage," Elias echoed, and for the first time in months his anger became articulate, precise. He named things people rarely named at press conferences: betrayal, profiteering, the auctioning of ecosystems. He spoke not to make them listen to Pushkin, but to make them see what they were about to lose. Families whose wells would dry, mushrooms that fed mountain villages, children who learned the names of trees. The words were not the academic distance he had curated. They were the expose of a man who had watched his errors germinate into a threat. Tomasz laughed, the sound thin. He signaled a subordinate to call the police. Their permit, he said, was ironclad. The loggers cheered, comforted by law. Elias felt the old mechanics of power press against him like an oncoming storm. He moved again, not with the journalist's instinct to reveal, but with the sacrament of someone who offers himself as a wedge.
He stepped between the chainsaw and the nearest beech, and then, as if he had rehearsed nothing and yet understood everything, he pressed his palms flat to the tree and spread his weight. The men jeered, Tomasz barked, but the tree, immense and patient, accepted Elias the way the mountain accepts lichen. Anya saw the gesture, sudden, foolish, beautiful, and it cracked the shell she'd forged around herself. She rushed to his side, not to pull him back, but to place herself openly with him, rifle forgotten, ledger exposed. "You will not cut this tree while those files are being verified," she said, raising her voice in a human legalese that was part threat, part plea. "If you cut it now, witnesses will be compelled to act." The logger's confidence curdled into hesitation. The sound of chainsaws became mechanical theater rather than inevitability. Pushchin stepped into their periphery then, enormous and calm, and set her palms against the earth. The ground thrummed like a living drum, roots shifted as if flexing. Men who had believed themselves masters of contracts felt the old narrative of ownership tremble under their boots. Tomasz's patience snapped. He ordered the men to move Elias by force. A hand reached for his shoulder, rough and certain. Elias turned and met the man's grip with both hands and did not pull away. Let them haul him off, he thought. Let his body be the hinge. "Arrest him," Tomasz spat, and within seconds a small contingent, hired security, effective as municipal order, moved in. Men shoved Elias, trying to dislodge him from the beach. Anya pushed back, and the ledger slipped from her belt and tumbled open on the moss. Names lay like bones, betrayals, restitutions, the weight of a people's memory. The physical confrontation became choreography. A man pinned beneath a logger's knee, a ranger flinging herself between fists and trunk, the tree trembling with the shock of human bodies upon it. Elias tasted blood in his mouth when a boot struck his ribs. Pain was a compass. Pain oriented him to the decision he'd made and would sustain. He did not scream. He only held his hands to the tree until a bruise bloomed across his side. A figure moved along the canopy, a shimmer that was not human. Pushchin made a sound that unsettled the men more than any weapon could. An ancient call like wind rolled through a canyon. Birds took to the air in a frantic column. The loggers staggered, suddenly small against something older than their permits. In the chaos, Anya leaned down to Elias, and with a steadiness born of years of hiding and then choosing exposure, kissed him briefly, an anchor, the kind of kiss that says, "I will not desert you, even if it costs me everything." It was not theatrical. It was a vow in miniature. He tasted pine and metal and the roughness of her lips. The world narrowed to that pressure, and then widened to the possibility of consequence.
The sheriff's lights finally appeared down the ridge, the result of frantic calls Anya had made to allies who still believed in her kind of law. Tomasz tried to smooth his face into a mask of civility, and the men around him gathered, words about permits rehearsed. But the ledger lay open. The Marku names had witnesses. The machine stood idle as paperwork and public eyes made profit precarious. They read from the ledger the names of villages affected by logging contracts. People who had been farmers stepped from the tree line, faces lined with years of knowing wood. The sheriff, seeing the crowd and hearing the claims, did what bureaucrats sometimes do when the optics of injustice are raw. He called for a pause. Papers were examined. Phones were surrendered. For a while, the machine was an abashed animal under scrutiny. It was not a victory so much as a reprieve. Tomasz's convoy idled, and he calculated damages and headlines in a face the color of money. Elias lay on the moss and felt the pressure recede from his limbs like a tide. Anya stayed at his side, fingers tracing the edge of his jaw, as if memorizing a face that might become a pledge. Pushchin looked on with a gaze that was unreadable, and in that inscrutability, an approval like snow settling. When the sheriff finally spoke, it was with the weary cadence of a man forced into an ethical corner. There would be an inquiry, he said. For now, the logging was suspended until permits could be verified. Tomasz was ordered to withdraw until legalities were cleared. The convoy left, not with heads,